In the quiet town of Ludasha, nestled between rolling green hills and ancient willow trees, stood a house that seemed to hold its breath. It sat at the very top of Elderberry Hill, where the mist clung to its stone walls and birds circled the gables without ever daring to nest. People in the town often paused to glance up at it from the market road, whispering to one another about its eerie silence and the shadows that moved behind the lace-draped windows. Children crossed themselves when passing by, convinced the stone lions that guarded the entrance blinked at dusk. The house was not haunted, not in the way of creaking doors or footsteps in empty halls, but in something much quieter, the kind of haunting that settles into bricks and wood, born from secrets and old pain rather than ghosts. It was a grand house, built with the kind of wealth that old families hid rather than flaunted, and it wore its age like a brooding secret. Its chimneys rarely smoked, its garden barely bloomed, and no music or laughter had danced through its corridors in years. Yet it stood firm, defiant even, as though it knew its own importance and refused to crumble. Some said the house had once been alive, truly alive, filled with voices, guests, and music that spilled out through open windows in summer. But those days had faded like ink on a wet page, and now the house only watched, waited, endured. It seemed to age not with time, but with the people inside it. And though no one dared to say it aloud, many believed that the house itself was waiting for something, or someone. They called it the Alston estate, though few in Ludasha could recall precisely which Alston had built it. The name was just an echo now, spoken with reverence and unease. What they did know was that a new lady had arrived at the estate, and she made sure everyone knew her name. Cecilia, tall, sharp-eyed, and always dressed like she had come from some important luncheon in the city, she walked through the marketplace with the confidence of someone who expected doors to open before she even knocked. She had arrived one chilly spring morning, her heels tapping against the estate's marble floors like a gavel claiming ownership. Her presence changed the air inside the house. It was no longer silent exactly, but filled with the sort of noise that came from controlled footsteps and clinking jewelry and cold perfume. Her laughter was brittle and her words clipped, like someone always slightly on edge, always proving something. Most people assumed she had always been there. Someone of her stature surely belonged in a house like that, but in truth, Cecilia had been there less than a year. She had married Gregory Alston after a short and quiet courtship, though no one in town had ever been invited to the wedding. She moved into the house and quickly assumed the role of mistress, as though someone had left it empty just for her to fill. She dismissed the cook who had been there since before the boy was born. She changed the wallpaper in the sitting room to match a magazine she'd seen in the city. She even had the gardener dig up Annabelle's rose bushes, calling them too sentimental. Within weeks, the house had transformed, not in color or architecture, but in feeling, colder, sharper, less like a home, and more like a space to be managed. Gregory himself was a quieter man, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and deeply tired, the kind of tired that sleep could not fix. He rarely came down to the village, and when he did, he barely spoke. People remembered a time, years before Cecilia, when Gregory had been livelier, always seen with a young boy by his side and a beautiful woman on his arm. That woman, they now whispered, was long gone. Some said she died in her sleep. Others believed she simply walked out one night and never returned. What no one could agree on was what happened to her estate. And yes, some remembered it had been hers, not Gregory's. But time had blurred those lines, and with Cecilia walking the halls like a queen in her palace, few dared to question ownership. She took up residence in the master suite, reorganized the staff, and gave orders with an unsettling ease. Even Gregory seemed to shrink beneath her, allowing her to speak on his behalf, to silence his son when he asked too many questions, to decide which paintings stayed on the walls and which memories were boxed up and taken to the attic. And the boy Illen became less visible with each passing day, as though Cecilia's arrival had dimmed some inner light that no one had noticed until it was almost gone. Gregory spent more time in his study, pretending to be busy with ledgers and letters, but even the staff could tell he was avoiding something, or someone. He had the look of a man who had made a choice he now regretted, but who lacked the courage to undo it. His hands trembled more now, especially when Illen entered the room, yet he said nothing. He always said nothing. Illen was a quiet child, slight for his age and pale in a way that suggested too many hours indoors. He had soft features that still held the roundness of early childhood, but his eyes were heavy, too knowing for someone not yet 10. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then he used as few words as possible. After his mother vanished from his life, he had clung to his routines, the garden bench he sat on every afternoon, the stuffed rabbit he kept under his pillow, the corner of the library, where the sunlight hit the floor just right. But after Cecilia moved in, the routines began to disappear. The bench was replaced with new wrought iron furniture too cold to sit on. The rabbit was tossed into a donation box, only to be retrieved and hidden again under protest. The library's heavy curtains were drawn closed, suffocating the light. Cecilia did not yell at Illen, not in public, and certainly not when Gregory was around, but she had a way of making the child feel unwelcome. It was in her glances, her sighs, her quiet reminders to the maid that children should be seen and not heard. And so Illen, without being told directly, began to retreat, first from rooms, then from people, eventually even from himself. His voice, once soft but present, became a ghost of itself. He stopped asking questions, stopped playing with the wooden soldiers his mother had carved, stopped waiting at the window for his father to come home. The only place he still visited was the West Wing corridor, where the light was dim, and the silence felt kinder. He would sit on the floor, legs tucked beneath him, and whisper things to the walls that no one else would hear. The late morning sun cast pale light through the tall windows of the Alston estate, but warmth never reached the sitting room where Cecilia often held court. On this particular day, the air was motionless, heavy with the scent of lavender polish and old furniture. Tilda, the young maid who had only recently begun working at the estate, stood near the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. She was no more than 19, fresh from a rural township called Mernvale, and still unfamiliar with the intricate, invisible web of hierarchy that governed the estate's domestic life. Her eyes flicked nervously around the room, to the fireplace, the carved table legs, the stiff portraits of long-dead Alstons that lined the walls, but never dared rest on Cecilia directly. Cecilia sat near the window, sipping her morning tea with delicate precision, her body draped in a dark green house dress that looked severe against her pale skin. She didn't look up as she spoke, her voice smooth but cool, like silk drawn across stone. "There's something we need to be clear on, you and I," she said, tapping her teaspoon once against the porcelain. "That boy Illen, Gregory's son, you are not to feed him unless I say so. Meals are taken at fixed hours. Outside that, he is not to be given snacks, fruit, bread, milk, or anything else. Is that understood?" Tilda's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. There was something about Cecilia's presence that made resistance feel not only futile but foolish. "He's to learn discipline," Cecilia added, now turning her eyes toward Tilda. "He already gets more than enough attention from the cook and that woman who haunts the West Wing. I won't have you joining them." Tilda nodded quickly, but in her mind something small and uncertain had already begun to stir. Tilda's introduction to the estate had been quiet, uneventful, even a little dull at first. She had been assigned simple tasks, dusting windowsills, ironing linens, serving tea at 3:30, and lighting the corridor lamps at dusk. It wasn't until her third week that she began to notice Illen more often. He moved like a shadow through the house, barefoot and silent, slipping in and out of rooms with the eerie grace of a cat that no longer expected to be noticed. Once, while polishing the staircase railing, she had seen him sitting alone in the grand hallway, drawing circles on the floor with his fingertip. Another time, he had appeared beside her in the kitchen doorway, watching the flame of the oven with intense curiosity, before disappearing again before she could offer him a smile. It was on a rainy afternoon, while she was folding napkins in the dining room, that she heard his stomach growl. The sound was quiet, barely audible over the soft patter of rain on the window panes, but it reached her like a cry. He had been standing behind the curtain, hoping perhaps to sneak a few crumbs from the silver platter left for guests. Her heart clenched as he turned and walked away without a word, his small hands clasped tightly behind his back. That evening, the instructions Cecilia had given came back to her in full, not in words but in feeling, a coldness, a rule carved from spite rather than care. Tilda had grown up in a home where meals were scarce but always shared. To deny food to a hungry child, not out of necessity, but principle, felt wrong in a way that rattled something inside her. Yet she said nothing, did nothing. Fear can be a cage, and Tilda had stepped into it the moment she accepted the job. Margaret had noticed. She always did. Unlike Cecilia, she did not make declarations or raise her voice. She moved through the house softly, often seen only in the background at the far end of a hallway, by a window seat with a book, in the kitchen picking herbs from a glass jar, but her presence was not invisible. The staff respected her without needing to be reminded why. Even the butler, who had served 3 generations of Alstons, lowered his voice when she entered the room. She was the kind of woman who seemed to carry the memory of the house itself. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls in amber hues, Margaret entered the scullery and found Tilda scrubbing an already clean teacup. The girl's eyes were red, her posture tense. Margaret didn't ask questions at first. She simply pulled out a stool and sat down. "Is he being fed?" she asked calmly, but her voice had an edge sharp enough to slice through stone. Tilda froze. Her hands stilled, soap dripping from her fingers. Slowly, without looking up, she shook her head. Margaret did not respond right away. She looked out the window toward the garden, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she rose to her feet and motioned for Tilda to follow her. They walked in silence, down the long western corridor, where portraits of women, strong-chinned, proud-eyed, watched them from behind golden frames. Margaret stopped in front of a door few ever entered. She opened it and stepped inside, gesturing to a mahogany cabinet tucked in the corner. From it, she drew a leather-bound document, worn at the edges and marked with a dark red seal. She handed it to Tilda without a word. The girl blinked at it in confusion, then slowly opened the pages. What she saw drained the color from her face. The deed was written in old script, the ink slightly faded, but the words were clear. Property of Annabel Alston. Signed, stamped, dated. Further down, in neater handwriting, a legal clause marked the estate's inheritance. All rights, custodianship, and property belonging to this estate shall pass to her lawful child, Illen Alston, upon the death of the original owner. Until his majority, the residence shall be managed by a named guardian, Margaret Lynn Alston, as per the appended conditions. Tilda's eyes widened, her mouth trembled. "This house, it's not Mr. Gregory's?" she asked, as though trying to convince herself she had misread. Margaret shook her head. "It never was," she said softly. "Annabel built this house with her own fortune. Every stone, every room, every piece of land, it belongs to Illen. Gregory lives here because Annabel allowed it. And Cecilia, she only lives here because Gregory cannot say no." Tilda lowered her gaze. Shame rose like smoke in her chest. The weight of what she had participated in, starving a child in his own home, made her feel smaller than ever. Margaret placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's not your fault," she said, "but the moment you know the truth, you must decide who you are. Not everyone is brave, but I have a feeling you might be." The 2 women stood in silence, the sun slipping behind the trees as the house settled around them, and for the first time since she had arrived, Tilda felt its silence shift, not hostile, but waiting. A week passed, then another. Rain came and went, slipping down the estate's slate roof in long streaks, pooling in the cracks of the cobbled courtyard. Inside the house, time seemed to bend around the silence. Illen grew thinner. His shoes began to slip off his heels when he walked, and the sleeves of his shirts hung like fabric on a scarecrow. He never complained, never asked, never approached the kitchen again. Tilda, once clumsy with inexperience, now moved with a quiet grief, careful not to knock over anything, to not draw attention, to not give away the growing guilt swelling in her chest. She still served Cecilia's tea at the appointed hour, still folded the laundry, still lit the lamps with trembling hands, but each time she caught a glimpse of Illen, her throat tightened. The boy's movements had grown slower, and his eyes carried something older than fear, something like surrender. There was no tantrum, no sobbing. Just the haunting image of a child beginning to understand the cost of existing in a place where he was unwanted. He'd retreat into forgotten rooms, sometimes sitting for hours on the narrow window ledge near the back stairwell, his knees drawn to his chest, staring out over the gardens. The house had many eyes, many corners, many spaces where a child could disappear without vanishing. It was in one of these corners that Tilda once found him asleep, curled into himself. His fingers curled around a handkerchief Margaret had embroidered with blue thread. She didn't wake him. She simply knelt beside him and cried silently, tears falling onto the cold marble floor unnoticed. Margaret had taken to watching from a distance, never interrupting, never demanding. She knew the shape of suffering, and she recognized it now. She had seen it once before, in Annabel's face, the weeks before her death, when the light had started to leave her eyes. Now she saw it in Illen, but Margaret was not a woman given to haste. She believed in time, in small actions, in pieces falling together with deliberate care. She did not scold Tilda for following Cecilia's orders. She had, after all, seen many young girls bend beneath the weight of false authority. But she watched, observed, measured, and she waited. Each day she placed small clues in Tilda's path, a warm biscuit left untouched on a side table, a soft blanket folded and draped over the boy's favorite bench in the conservatory, a candle lit in the narrow hallway where Illen once played marbles with his mother. The house, too, responded. Its silence was no longer flat. It shifted and sighed in the floorboards, groaned softly at dusk, hummed through the pipes, as if something buried deep within it was beginning to stir. Margaret would often pass by Illen's door at night, pausing just long enough to ensure he was breathing. He never locked it, but he no longer slept deeply. The loss of nourishment and warmth had made him restless, half awake even in sleep. His small body curled in self-defense against a world too large and too cruel. One morning, Margaret left a single apple on the sill outside his window, knowing full well he would see it before anyone else. She said nothing. The next day it was gone, the stem left behind like a quiet thank you. It was then she knew the boy still had hope. In the house's south wing, where the light rarely reached and the walls remained damp year-round, Gregory kept to his study. Books filled the shelves in neat rows, and papers lay scattered across the desk in disorganized patterns that suggested more pretending than work. He spent most hours seated in the same armchair, nursing a glass of brandy that never emptied too quickly. His thoughts often wandered back to the early years, the quiet laughter of Annabel in the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread, Illen's baby hands reaching up for him. The past came in waves, and with each one came the bitter sting of choices made too easily, too selfishly. He had married again not for love but for convenience. After Annabel's death, the estate had weighed heavily on him, its upkeep, its staff, its history. He had welcomed Cecilia's sharpness because it spared him the burden of responsibility. She had taken charge before he ever realized he had handed her the reins, but now every time he looked into Illen's hollowed face, he saw what it had cost. He had not asked Cecilia how she treated the boy. He had not wanted to know. He had let himself believe that her sternness would teach strength, but deep down he knew the truth. It wasn't discipline. It was cruelty cloaked in civility, and he had allowed it. Perhaps he still allowed it. A few nights ago he had found one of Annabel's scarves in the linen chest, pale blue, embroidered with lilies, still holding a trace of her perfume. He had wept into it like a man much older than his years, shaking, trying not to make a sound. But tears did nothing now. Tears had come too late. Cecilia remained unaware of the shifting current beneath her feet. She moved through the house with her usual poise, her heels echoing on the tiled floors, her fingers tracing the velvet drapes as if they belonged to her by birthright. She noticed Illen less and less, not out of malice, but from a deep-rooted belief that he was irrelevant. A relic from a story she hadn't authored. She considered Margaret an odd relic too, a woman too quiet to be a threat, too calm to be confronted. Cecilia focused instead on the details she could control. The placement of new china in the dining room, the arrival of a new chandelier she had ordered from Ventridge, the fabric swatches for the drawing-room chairs. She was a woman building an empire on borrowed land, unaware that the ground was already being reclaimed. She spoke to Tilda only when necessary, issuing orders without looking up, but once, while sipping her coffee near the fireplace, she remarked in passing, "The boy's growing stubborn. Perhaps it's time we send him to school in the city, someplace strict, where he can learn obedience." She said it as casually as one might suggest trimming a hedge. Tilda, who stood by with a cloth in her hand, froze. She did not speak, she did not move. But that moment, brief and cold, shifted something inside her. Cecilia would never understand the weight of her words. She did not hear the walls listen, or the house tighten around her like a patient animal. She did not notice Margaret at the far end of the hallway, watching her silently. The estate, once dormant, had begun to remember, and I did not forget it lightly. It began with a single creak in the attic floorboards, long after the rest of the house had fallen into its usual, breath-held silence. Margaret, lantern in hand, moved slowly up the narrow staircase behind the linen closet, her shadow flickering against the faded wallpaper that peeled slightly at the corners. This passageway was rarely used, not because it was forbidden, but because few remembered it even existed. The air grew colder with every step, tinged with the scent of dust and cedar and something else, something older. When she reached the top landing, she didn't pause, didn't hesitate, not even when the lantern dimmed as if uncertain. She knew what she had come for. In the far corner of the attic, beneath a slanted beam and an old oil painting that had long since lost its color, sat a chest covered in layers of linen and time. Margaret knelt beside it. Her fingers, though gentle, didn't tremble. She removed the clothes with care, revealing a box of red silk, weather-worn, but untouched by mold or moths. The latches still worked. When she opened it, the scent of old paper drifted up to meet her, familiar, strangely comforting. Inside were letters, some in blue ink, others written with the black-tipped fountain pen Annabel had once used for everything. Margaret ran her fingers along the top envelope. She didn't cry. She had shed all her tears years ago, but her chest tightened, not with sadness, but with something quieter, a sense of duty long delayed but never forgotten. Annabel had written these letters for Illen in the months when she knew her time was running out, not because of illness, not because of age, but because, as Margaret always suspected, she had known something was coming, a storm silent and slow building behind smiles and silence. When Margaret returned to the main house, the box cradled in her arms like a fragile heirloom. The corridors were still. It was just after supper. Cecilia had retired to the drawing room with a glass of white wine and a novel she never actually read. Gregory was, as usual, locked away in his study with the fireplace unlit and his mind lost in maps of the past. Illen was upstairs, curled into a blanket on the chaise by the window, staring at the rain. Tilda was wiping down the banister, pausing every few steps as if unsure why she was still bothering. Margaret moved with purpose. She didn't hide what she carried. She wanted to be seen. Not for recognition or challenge, but for the message her presence would deliver. When she entered the dining room, the chandelier above still glowed from dinner, casting a golden hue across the polished table. Cecilia looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of the box. She said nothing at first, only raised an eyebrow, her wineglass poised halfway to her lips. "Is that something from the attic?" she asked finally, her tone polite but laced with disdain. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she set the box carefully on the table, directly in front of Illen's untouched dessert plate. She untied the ribbon with slow, deliberate fingers, letting the silk fall aside. The sound of paper brushing against paper filled the room, delicate and steady. She withdrew the top letter, its envelope sealed with a faded wax stamp that bore the letter A, and placed it gently into Illen's hands. The boy didn't move at first. He looked at Margaret, then at the box, then finally at the envelope. "It's from your mother," Margaret said, her voice low, steady, intimate. "She wrote to you many times." The room seemed to freeze. Cecilia set down her glass a little too hard, and for the first time since she entered the house, her silence was not out of control but confusion. She didn't understand what was happening. Gregory, who had emerged unnoticed from the hallway, stood in the doorway, his face drained of color. Illen touched the edge of the envelope as if it might dissolve under his fingers. The letter, when read aloud, carried Annabel's voice into the room like a long-forgotten song. She had written not just to tell stories, but to guide, to remind, to preserve what she feared others would twist or forget. "My sweet boy," it began, "if you are reading this, I am no longer beside you, but I am never far. This house, our home, holds my heartbeat in every corner. The ivy on the walls remembers your laughter. The floors know your first steps, and though others may walk its halls, never forget, this place is yours." Margaret didn't interrupt. She allowed the boy to read at his own pace, his voice fragile, but unwavering. Each sentence seemed to pull something from deep within him, not just memory, but strength. Cecilia, standing now, tried to speak. "This is all very dramatic," she began, but Gregory raised a hand, silencing her with a glance. "Let him finish," he said, his voice hoarse. Illen continued. Annabel's words spoke of her hopes, her fears, her love. She described the garden she had planted, so he would always have something living to care for. She detailed where certain keys were hidden, which doors were safe, which people to trust. And in the final paragraph, she had written something that struck a chord so deep the room seemed to fall away. "There may come a time when someone makes you feel small in your own home. When that day comes, you must remember you were born of strength, not silence. This house remembers, and so should you." Illen lowered the letter. His hands trembled slightly, but he was upright, not curled, not hiding. For the first time in months, he felt taller than his shadow. The silence that followed was unlike the silences before. It was not heavy, it was not sharp. It felt like breath after drowning, fragile but free. Margaret looked at Gregory, and in that glance was years of conversation unsaid. He nodded, a slow motion, heavy with understanding. He had known, maybe not all, but enough. Enough to know he had wronged his son, betrayed his first love's memory, and allowed a stranger to claim a place she never earned. Cecilia, flustered but still trying to maintain her composure, laughed nervously. "All of this sentiment for a few old papers?" she said, gesturing to the box. Her voice trembled despite her effort to sound amused. "What exactly are you hoping to prove?" Margaret stepped forward then, her expression unreadable, but her voice firm. "I'm not proving anything," she replied. "Annabel already did, and now it's time to act on it." She turned to Tilda, who stood at the edge of the room, wide-eyed, unsure whether to flee or remain. "Take the box to Illen's room," Margaret instructed, "and tomorrow call Mr. Everett. He'll know what to do with the documents." Cecilia narrowed her eyes. "Who is Everett?" she asked. Margaret, without looking at her, replied, "The estate's lawyer, the one listed on the original deed. You wouldn't know him." That last sentence, delivered without malice, without heat, landed with the force of a judgment. Cecilia stood frozen, her power fading like sunlight at dusk, unaware that the house itself had already turned its back on her. Morning broke with a strange hush over the estate, as if even the trees held their breath. A soft wind moved through the hallways, slipping under doors and brushing against windows, carrying with it a subtle tension that had settled like fog overnight. Margaret stood at the back of the house, hands folded behind her back, watching a pair of robins hop between the empty flower beds where Annabel's moonlilies had once bloomed. Her face was unreadable, but her mind was anything but still. The letters had been read. The box had been returned to Illen's room, now tucked safely beneath his bed like a buried seed waiting to sprout. The truth, long silenced, had been spoken aloud, and once spoken, could never be taken back. For years she had guarded that truth, unsure if the boy was ready to carry the weight of it. But now she saw the change in him. His voice, though small, no longer trembled. His eyes had steadied. There was something blooming in him, not anger, not yet, but awareness. And awareness was a beginning. Margaret moved from the window slowly, the rhythm of her steps soft but purposeful. She had summoned Mr. Everett just before dawn, sending a telegram through the only trusted clerk in Ludasha. There was no need for lengthy explanations. One sentence had sufficed, Enact Clause 12, immediate enforcement. Everett, who had not heard from the estate in over 7 years, replied within the hour. He was already en route. Cecilia, meanwhile, remained in the house as though nothing had changed, but her footing had shifted. She noticed it first in the glances of the staff, more deliberate, less hurried. No one was outright defiant, but things no longer moved around her with the same anxious energy. She rang the bell for tea, but it came 5 minutes late. She asked Tilda to bring her shawl, only to be met with a steady, "It's being laundered, ma'am." When she walked down the main hallway, she caught Margaret's eyes once, lingering at the far end near the grand clock. But there was no bow of acknowledgement, no small smile of concession. It was as if Cecilia had become transparent, a shape still present but fading. At breakfast, Gregory barely looked up from his plate. He ate quietly, eyes downcast, chewing methodically as though he were afraid to speak. Illen sat beside him, straighter than usual, quiet, but no longer cowering. He wore one of his older jackets, mended and brushed clean, the sleeves still a bit long. He said nothing, but he kept his fork in his right hand the entire meal, finishing every bite without needing to be prompted. Cecilia noticed. She watched him with a growing sense of disquiet. He had always been the quiet one, the soft one, easy to overlook, but now the quiet had taken on edges, and it unsettled her. She reached for her cup, but her hand trembled slightly. In the stillness of the room, the sound of the spoon clinking against the saucer was louder than she expected. She cleared her throat. "I'll be going into town later," she said, not expecting or needing a response. None came. Just after midday, the arrival of Mr. Everett altered the tone of the house as though someone had shifted the key of a long-playing melody. His carriage was plain, his coat dark, his presence unassuming, but his name still carried the weight of authority within the estate. He had served Annabel for more than a decade and knew every clause, every provision, every hidden corner of her intentions. Tilda answered the door and let him through without needing to be told. Margaret met him in the sitting room, the curtains drawn back, sunlight spilling across the rugs like a gentle spotlight. There were no greetings beyond a quiet nod. They had no need for small talk. Everett placed his briefcase on the table and withdrew a single sheet of parchment, not thick, not ornate, but stamped and sealed in the lower left corner with Annabel's signature crest. Cecilia entered moments later, dressed impeccably as always, a book still in hand as if to suggest she'd only stopped by for a moment. When she saw Everett, her expression faltered for the briefest second before recovering into something cool. "Ah, legal company," she said, her tone lightly amused. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Everett stood and bowed his head. "Clause 12, he replied simply. "Under the provisions of Annabel Alston's final testament and deed of inheritance, the estate reserves the right to revoke residency privileges from any adult whose presence is deemed harmful or disruptive to the well-being of her son, Illen Alston, legal heir and proprietor of the Alston estate, until his majority." The words did not echo, but they didn't need to. They landed softly like snow, but burned as they settled. Cecilia stared at him, mouth slightly ajar. There was a moment, just one, when Cecilia looked around the room and saw clearly for the first time that she was alone. Gregory stood by the fireplace, arms folded, his face carved from regret. Margaret remained seated, her hands resting on the arm of the chair, unmoved. Illen stood beside the grandfather clock, not speaking, not reacting, simply watching. And in that moment, Cecilia understood something she had refused to accept. This house had never belonged to her. The walls that she had decorated, the halls she had walked like a queen, the people she had ordered about, none of them had ever truly answered her. She was not mistress here. She had been a guest, an uninvited one. Her voice, when it came, was shrill. "This is absurd," she said, though even she seemed unsure of it. "I am Gregory's wife. This is our home. You can't possibly expect me to leave because of some old paper." Everett did not flinch. "It is not paper. It is the law, signed and sealed by the property's legal owner." "She's dead," Cecilia snapped, the mask slipping. "And I have done nothing wrong to that child. Nothing. I only set rules. Children need rules." "And yet," Margaret said softly, "he was hungry." For weeks, Cecilia's face paled. Her gaze darted to Gregory, but he looked away. "Gregory," she said, voice cracking, "tell them." He said nothing. Her breath hitched. "Gregory." "You should leave while you can," he finally said, eyes still not meeting hers, "before Illen remembers everything." The door did not slam. It didn't creak either. It simply shut, with a quiet thud that echoed more than it should have, the kind of sound that marked not just a departure, but a finality. Cecilia's footsteps faded down the stone steps, followed by the rolling of suitcase wheels over gravel. No one followed. No one watched from the window. The house, once ruled by her clipped tones and heavy perfumes, exhaled as though it had been holding in breath for too long. Margaret remained in the hallway, hand resting on the wooden banister, her eyes fixed on a smudge near the floor where Cecilia's heels had once scuffed the wood. Illen stood nearby, still holding the last letter he'd read from the red silk box. His fingers curled around the edges of the envelope, but he did not tremble. Tilda, watching from the stairway, glanced between the boy and the now empty doorway. She expected someone to say something, a word, even a breath of relief, but no one spoke. It wasn't joy they felt. It wasn't vengeance or triumph. It was released. Not from a person, but from a grip. A shadow had lifted. One that had moved between them quietly for far too long, shaping every glance, every meal, every silence. And now it is gone. Yet with its absence came something unfamiliar, space. A wide, uncertain space where pain had once lived. And in that space, something else was beginning to settle. The fragile, flickering possibility of healing. The first few days after Cecilia's departure passed without ceremony. Meals resumed their rhythm, not hurried, not forced, but natural, gentle, as if the kitchen itself had softened. Illen began to join Margaret and Tilda in the dining room again, not every time, but more than before. He spoke in short sentences, often only answering when asked, but there was no longer hesitation in his voice. He didn't flinch when footsteps approached. He didn't hide his plate when he took a second helping. The small things, once lost beneath the weight of caution, began returning. Gregory, though still distant, tried to mend the quiet fracture between himself and his son. He sat beside him one afternoon near the greenhouse, watching Illen trace the veins of a leaf with his finger. "Your mother used to do that," he said softly, as though the words were almost too fragile to carry. Illen didn't respond, but he didn't walk away either. That was enough for now. Margaret resumed tending the gardens, her hands deep in soil from dawn to dusk. She replanted the moon lilies, not in neat rows, but in wide, gentle arcs, as Annabel had once done. She spoke less now, letting the work speak for her. Tilda remained at the estate, but her role shifted. She was no longer just the maid. She became a fixture, familiar, trusted, present. She began baking again, and every morning without fail, she left a warm pastry by the window ledge in Illen's room. He never mentioned it, but the empty plate was always returned by noon, wiped clean, as if the act itself was its own quiet form of thank you. In the evenings, the house took on a different sound. Not noise, not music even, but movement. The creaking of the staircase as Margaret made her rounds, the soft rattle of Illen's toy chest as he sorted through old belongings, the gentle thud of a book closing in the study where Gregory now spent less time drinking and more time reading through Annabel's journals. The estate, for all its grandeur, had been built for family, not guests, and now that truth began to show itself again. In small, nearly invisible ways, it started remembering who it was. The walls that had once stood cold under Cecilia's watch now held warmth. Rooms that had remained locked or neglected were slowly reopened. The music room with its dusty piano was cleaned by Tilda one morning. She found an old music sheet tucked between the keys, Annabel's handwriting in the margins, small notes reminding herself to hold the silence between notes. Illen found the courage to touch the keys a few days later. The sound was imperfect, stiff, hesitant, but it filled the air and no one stopped him. In fact, Margaret simply sat outside the room, reading by the light from the hallway. She didn't compliment him, didn't praise or interrupt. She let him play, let the house listen. Let the sound of something living fill the void that had once seemed permanent. Even the birds returned to the garden walls, nesting in the corners beneath the eaves, as though the house had finally allowed itself to be a home again. Margaret kept the red silk box in her room now, tucked beside her books. Illen no longer asked for the letters, but he knew where they were. Some nights he would sit on her bed while she brushed her hair, and they'd speak in slow, scattered sentences, not always about Annabel, sometimes just about the lilies, or the smell of the soil after rain, or the shape of clouds drifting above the hill. They did not rush toward healing. They didn't name it. They simply lived, one day into the next, with small kindnesses guiding the way. Gregory eventually moved into one of the guest rooms at the back of the estate, not because anyone forced him, but because he understood that space was sometimes the first apology. He no longer made speeches or asked forgiveness. He planted a small tree outside Illen's window, a willow sapling, and tended it every morning. Illen never mentioned it, but each day he marked its growth, watching it stretch toward the sun. On the anniversary of Annabelle's passing, Margaret placed a candle in the drawing room. No ceremony, no prayer, just a soft flickering flame surrounded by silence. That night, for the first time, Illen asked her to read one of the letters aloud. She did. Her voice is calm, unhurried, filled with the warmth of a sister keeping a promise, and when she finished, Illen rested his head on her shoulder, not weeping, not speaking, but simply existing beside her. It was enough. Sometimes that is what love becomes, not a declaration, but the choice to remain present, even in the quietest rooms. My dear listeners, if this story touched your heart in any way, then lean in closely now. Because there's something important to take from all you've just heard. Sometimes people will live in your house and never know who truly owns it. They may walk with loud feet, speak with bold tongues, and treat others like they are dust beneath their sandals. But let me tell you, time always speaks louder than pride. Never envy people who wear confidence like a crown, but carry emptiness in their hearts. Because in the end, truth never trembles. It simply waits. If you are like Illen, quiet, overlooked, forgotten, hold on. Your story is still being written. If you're like Margaret, carrying the pain of someone else's silence, but still choosing love, may you never lose your strength. And if you're like Tilda, torn between fear and conscience, may your heart always guide your hands. Now let me pray for you. Prayer for my listeners. May your home be filled with peace that cannot be shaken. May every evil voice speaking against your destiny be silenced without you needing to raise your voice. May the truth in your life rise like the morning sun, unstoppable and bright. May God expose every hidden agenda against you, and let your quiet obedience speak louder than the loudest lies. May you never beg where you are meant to be blessed. May your children never suffer in the hands of people who smile in your presence, but starve them behind closed doors. May your reward find you, even when no one claps for you. And may your name be remembered for good in places your feet haven't even stepped yet. If you believe this prayer is for you, type a bold amen in the comments. And may your amen echo in heaven and open doors you never knew existed.